social enterprises and engage with the Social Partnership and Public Procurement Wales Bill. Now, as many of you will already know, that bill's aim is to improve public services in Wales through social partnership working, promoting fair work and socially responsible public procurement. And the bill passed stage 4 in the Senedd on the 14th of March this year, so it's now waiting for royal assent before it becomes law. The bill is going to place specific duties on the Welsh Government and public bodies, including that they'll establish a social partnership council, place a social partnership duty on certain bodies, require specified public bodies to consider socially responsible public procurement, and public procurement strategies will be published as well. So the Welsh Government has also committed to making Wales a fair work nation, where workers are fairly rewarded, heard and represented, secure and able to progress in a healthy, inclusive environment where rights are respected. And many of these principles have, of course, been central to the devolution journey. The bill marks the next stage of the process as it seeks to embed and formalise a social partnership approach to developing a fairer and more resilient economy. So, today then, our first speaker is Nisreen Mansour, who is the Policy Officer at Wales TUC. And Nisreen is going to offer us the Wales TUC's perspective on this legislation, how it can produce a better deal for workers and communities, and how the cooperative model can play a key role in developing these principles. So welcome, Nisreen, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Vicky. I'm going to try and share my screen because I've got some slides to go through. As it's framework legislation, it's fairly dry and technical, so I think slides definitely help. Just need to work out how to actually make it into a slideshow though. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, that's worked.
Great, thank you, Harry. Okay, so to begin with, I'll just talk a bit about what the Wales TUC is, how we've come to this point with the legislation and what it means to us as a trade union movement. So the Wales TUC represents 48 affiliated trade unions. Not all of those have a membership in Wales. We probably have around 40 with membership in Wales. Around 400,000 workers in Wales are members of a trade union. The vast majority of those are affiliated to the TUC, although some of the big ones that you've heard of that aren't affiliated are the RCN and the BMA. So as a union movement, this bill has been a big priority for us. Although it's Welsh Government legislation, it's been produced in social partnership. So right from the outset, there were trade union colleagues seconded in, employer side colleagues seconded in. So that principle of social partnership of having workers, worker representatives and employers and employer representatives around the table has really been apparent from the outset of this legislation. So it's a quite a novel approach, and we still actually have people seconded in there now to work on the implementation and that wider kind of fair work message across government. It was called for by the Wales TUC during the leadership campaign of Mark Drakeford, and it's very much part of like an ongoing journey of social partnership and embedding the social partnership principle in government. So from the very first Wales Act, there was the idea of a business scheme in Wales. So the idea that when government consulted with business, they consulted with both the employer side representatives and the trade union representatives, which doesn't exist even in Scotland. So it's quite a unique sort of Welsh way, it's often termed of as being the approach of how government works in Wales. And it really got to the point, I think, where unions felt that we needed to get this onto a statutory footing to future-proof it. And we also needed to make sure that it was something that was apparent across government. So, you know, there are still departments which unions don't really have much of a relationship with in government. So this is a way of strengthening that as well. So I'll just talk you through some of the key bits of the legislation. So it's going to put a social partnership duty on public bodies covered by the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So again, social partnership, we're using it in quite a narrow defined way here to mean both worker and employer representatives. It's going to amend the Prosperous Wales goals so that we get that consistent approach to fair work throughout government and throughout the devolved public sector. It's going to create socially responsible procurement duties that will go on a much wider range of public bodies than those just covered by the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And again, I think that's been part of a priority for successive governments in Wales about really kind of getting the best value out of public spending and thinking about the wider social and environmental impacts. And it's going to establish a social partnership council because everybody needs another meeting. So social partnership duty is sometimes the social partnership bill is referred to as being parasitic legislation in terms of it completely hangs on the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It sounds quite sort of unpleasant to say parasitic, but it's very much a way of embedding worker voice into that Wellbeing of Future Generations Act approach, particularly in terms of that sustainable development principle. So it will apply in public bodies which are covered by the Future Generations Act, and when they are required to create and set and strategically plan for how they will achieve the wellbeing goals, they have to reach consensus or compromise with their recognised unions. So in a health board, for instance, they recognise tends to be between sort of 8 and 10 trade unions. They have to put in place a process to reach consensus or compromise with those unions about their objectives and how they will go about reaching them. The list of public bodies covered by the social partnership duty and obviously the Future Generations Act is pretty extensive as well. So it's the vast majority of the devolved public sector, including councils, health boards, the National Museum, things like the Arts Council, sector funders like HEFCU, and the legislation is updated to bring in new bodies as well. So something like the Commission for Tertiary Education and Research is going to then be covered by the Future Generations Act. So looking ahead, this is where the kind of exciting bit is going to start happening in the next few months and years in terms of how we can really kind of draw out opportunities from what this legislation is offering, particularly in terms of the social partnership duty, because I think that is the biggest step being taken by this legislation. Never before have we had workers, have we had unions having a say over the kind of strategic objectives of their organisation when it comes to economic development, when it comes to environmental sustainability, and all the other aspects covered by the Future Generations Act and the wellbeing goals. There is still a lot of ambiguity about how it will work in practice. So it says that they will require consensus or compromise with their recognised unions. If you think of a local authority, those people directly employed by a local authority tend to be represented by one of the big 3 unions, so Unite, Unison or GMB. They are meeting with the employers regularly, they have existing relationships. But local authorities also technically recognise teaching unions, they technically recognise the head teachers unions, they have other relationships with unions. It's how that is going to be, formed into this kind of routine way of working around the social partnership duty that we're yet to really get a clear idea on. And I think that's very important when you're thinking about campaigning and working with unions to achieve the objectives that you want, who you need to work with. There is a huge challenge to get unions ready to engage strategically on the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. I've got to be honest, I don't think I knew what the Act was before this legislation came about. The language alone is alienating, like to have the confidence to go into a meeting and talk confidently about the wellbeing goals, I think will be really, a big step for union officials in these workplaces, because it's just not their day-to-day job. They're used to talking about, RPI and other inflation measures and employment rights and industrial relations. This is like a totally new set of language and kind of, it's very policy speak. So we've got a massive challenge to just get people prepared to engage on this work. But we do think that it offers the potential for really kind of innovative campaigning. So implementing through public bodies, and I think particularly local authorities offer a huge opportunity, those kinds of social, environmental, economic changes that we want to see as a, potentially a kind of very wide labour movement through the various powers that these public bodies have. So, for instance, some of our unions have been campaigning around the experiences of nighttime economy workers, as people working in bars and clubs and restaurants and things who have to leave late at night. They're not able to use public transport necessarily because the public transport system isn't in place. They're not being paid by their employer for their travel home. They are licensed though by councils. And now their union will have a say within those councils about the strategic priorities of their employer. And so it gives that potential to set out wider union priorities within those public bodies to take advantage of the various powers that these bodies have, whether that's licensing, whether that's enforcement, whether it's how they spend their money. And I think this is also where we can think about collaboration across the kind of labour movement. So thinking about public spend, thinking about the role of things like unionised cooperatives and how public bodies, including health boards and councils, are investing in these types of businesses to make sure that we are developing our economy in the way that we want to see. So it's only a minor change in terms of the Prosperous Wales goal, but it is one of the 4 key parts of the bill from our perspective, and that is around changing the wording from decent work to fair work. Not everybody is keen on this. I'm going to just skip forward to this slide. So the Prosperous Wales goal sets out the kind of economic development ambitions for Wales. It's the shared goal that all public bodies are bound by through the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And this just brings in that policy coherence. So rather than referencing decent work, it now says fair work throughout. We subscribe to it, and Welsh Government subscribes to the definition of fair work set out in the Fair Work Commission's report from a couple of years ago. It's quite comprehensive. It sets out that unions are both, collective bargaining and union recognition is both a part of the definition of fair work, but also the way to achieve fair work. So it's something that really kind of brings into Welsh policy the ILO, the International Labour Organization, fundamental worker rights. So yeah, not a huge change, and maybe not as ambitious as we wanted in terms of there being, eventually a fair work duty on public bodies in Wales, but it's a good example of the constraints that Welsh Government was working in to get this legislation through. So the third key part of the bill is the socially responsible procurement duties. So this is about an overarching duty on a very broad range of public bodies to set socially responsible procurement objectives. So again, as framework legislation, it's not going into great detail about what these objectives will look like in the majority of cases, but it is setting this duty that public bodies have to start strategically planning about how they can use their public spend to bring about socially responsible outcomes, which is absolutely, I think, crucial for both our and your objectives as sort of that wider labour movement. There are specific duties on construction in the bill, so it's large construction projects of 2 million plus. This is fairly innovative stuff in terms of putting project management duties on, so the idea that certain obligations have to cascade through a supply chain, and that's something that we are really, really pleased to see, because there is a huge amount of labour exploitation within the construction industry, a lot of rogue practice. It really can't just be, summed up as being about poor pay. It's about health and safety issues. It's about very poor use of contracts, all sorts of bad practice that makes it very hard for workers to have even their basic rights upheld. The legislation also puts the 2-tier code on a legal footing. So that's around the outsourcing of workers and making sure that there is parity with the directly employed workforce at the point of outsourcing. And it is really important to consider which bodies, even though this is a horrendous slide, it's important to consider which bodies it applies to. So it goes beyond the Future Generations Act list into some of the smaller bodies. It doesn't include universities or housing associations though, and I think that that's a significant omission given the level of spend and power they have, particularly in sectors like construction. And I think it's something that as a movement we will be lobbying for in future. Where we are really excited about though is this idea about those construction duties and what exactly employers and public bodies will be required to monitor, to promote, to deliver on through public spend. So the idea that you have potentially repercussions for not complying with legal obligations through a supply chain, that could be a really big step in making sure that we see a real rise in legal compliance with employment and health and safety law, and also with issues of blacklisting of trade unionists, for instance, in the public sector supply chains and construction. There are also opportunities for both SMEs, but specifically voluntary organisations to execute work, and providing opportunities for under EU law, it was termed disadvantaged workers. And that's building on what we've seen already Welsh Government achieved through the Better Jobs Closer to Home pilots of actually reserving contracts in the public sector for initiatives that ring fence employment opportunities for disadvantaged workers. So this could really start to kind of normalise some of that pilot work that Welsh Government has done, including with Compass. Onto the Social Partnership Council. I think this is something that is fairly alienating, I think, for people that don't sit on social partnership bodies, because it's all very kind of meeting based, and it's quite sort of yeah, it sounds strange to call it a council. So this is a tripartite body that will sit essentially as a system leader within social partnership working. Currently, in terms of trade unions and how we work with employers, you have organisations at a local workplace level, so within a health board, within a local authority, unions and the employer will meet. We have national structures, so we've got the NHS Partnership Forum, for instance, and this Social Partnership Council that this legislation creates will sit at the top of that. It will include 9 trade union representatives, 9 employer side representatives, including representation from the social business economy, and it will include 9 representatives of government. And their role will be to advise ministers on the types of guidance, the types of information they are putting out in relation to the duties set out in the bill. So it will be really, really crucial for kind of delivering that framework that will see the social changes that we want to see. Just beyond the bill, I just want to touch quickly on the kind of wider work that we're doing. So that's around sector social partnership. We've got really successful forums in retail, in social care. Visitor economy is still getting off the ground, but again, these are arrangements whereby we've got workers and employers sitting with government to determine the sort of whether it's their strategies, whether it's the policies they're introducing in those areas, making sure that worker voice is fully integrated. We're doing work with government around the economic contract in Business Wales in terms of integrating that fair work approach, which I think we have lots of kind of shared interest in, and work with government on the role of unions more broadly. So to make sure that we're seeing government take advantage of the opportunities they've got and the influence they've got to both influence workers, to join a union, to recognise the benefits of unionisation, and to make sure that employers are opening their door to trade unions to organise workers. So in terms of where we're going next with the bill, and well, the Act soon, I think Royal Assent is scheduled for the next couple of weeks. Our priorities are how prepared are officers, reps and activists to take advantage of the opportunities that these duties offer. It's just such a new area. It's so technical, it's so different to what we're used to doing. And so we know that there is a huge training need across our movement, and a huge need to kind of reconsider how we go about lobbying for change, whether that's for people who are directly employed by these public bodies or for the wider community. We need to consider whether we're making best use of the Future Generations Act already, and whether there is more that we can be doing to perhaps integrate the collective bargaining agenda and the Future Generations Act goals to make sure that, again, workers are really kind of getting the most out of what Welsh Government has already legislated for. We're questioning whether there are other sectors we should be focusing on. I've mentioned universities, I've mentioned housing associations. So how can we be as kind of maximalist as possible in terms of this social partnership approach and the socially responsible procurement duties? And then there's this question of like, will it make a difference, and how do we evidence it's making a difference, which is something that as a union movement we often struggle with. And I think we look to your movement with envy, because you're very good at this, I think, in terms of evidencing the impact that social business makes. But it's something that we really need to keep at the forefront of our minds, because I think showing union officers, particularly in the kind of climate we're in now of the highest level of industrial action we've seen in years, that this can actually be a really constructive model, something that leads to avoiding disputes, but also delivers mutual gains for employers and workers, could be really exciting, but it will take a lot of work to get it off the ground. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Oh, thank you very much, Nisreen. That was a really useful overview, and always good to have Wales TUC's perspective. So our next speaker then, focusing on employee ownership and the social partnership agenda, is Nicola Megan. I hope I've pronounced your surname correctly, Nicola.
Yeah, well done. Not many people do that.
Relief. It's always the most stressful part of a cross-party group. Nicola, you're the project manager at Employee Ownership Wales, aren't you? So.
Yeah, so I'll try and share my screen now. If not, Dan's got my backup slides, but I will try now. Let's have a look. No, it's not happening, Dan. Could you bring them up, please?
Sorry, just give me a minute.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I'll keep trying. I haven't got many slides, so and they're quite pretty pictures, so. So just to give an introduction then, and thank you for the introduction, Vicky. So proud are everyone. I'm Nicola, as Vicky said, and I lead on employee ownership at Compass, and I have done since about 2017. I'm also a trustee of Ownership at Work, which is a think tank linked to employee ownership. And there's a big piece of research going on across the UK at the moment on employee ownership, the socio-economic impact and the environmental impact as well. And oh, thanks, my slides are coming up. Good time then, Dan. So I plan then just to give an overview of employee ownership and its benefits, but also to say how I feel it fits with the social partnership. And maybe, you know, as Nisreen was saying, you know, we need to see this in practice as well. And while she was speaking, I thought of employee ownership throughout everything that she was saying, and reading up on the social partnership bill. You know, this does spring to mind and seems to be a really good fit. So you've got a nice picture there. On a UK level, that's where I'll start by looking at. We've got over 1,000 employee-owned businesses. Probably more than that now, and that's what that research I talked about will kind of bring to the forefront. It is a very fast-growing business model. So you can see there's some big names. So John Lewis, Tiptree, Jams, and funny enough, that was, if any of you watched Greg Wallace and The Factory last night, they were on there. It's nice to see them on there. Go Ape, which is kind of an outdoor adventure. Arup, you know, quite a big name, an engineering company. We've got one in Cardiff Bay as well there. Richer Sounds, to do with hi-fis. I think they started off as, but moved on since then. Unipart, you know, big name again, to do with the sort of do with vehicles, etc. And you can see Riverford Organics there as well. I love their strapline. live life on the veg. So they're very much about organic vegetables. And, you know, thinking of the environmental side, if you look on their website, and it's well worth having a look on their website, and a lot of these companies look on their website, and all the good that they're doing about plastic-free packaging. You know, they give you a veg box basically, and they have all been grown organically. So if you don't go look on any other website, have a look at Riverford Organics and their story, and it's really interesting. Except my colleagues who are on the call, does anybody know the name of the company that produces Wallace and Gromit? Anybody?
Can't remember.
Well, it's Aardman Animations, and they are employee owned as well. So all these companies are employee owned. Okay, so big names that we're all used to. So let's look at Wales then. Sorry, Dan, on to the next slide. We are just having an overwhelming growth in employee-owned businesses in Wales. You can see there Tregroes Waffles. One of the things, you know, I noticed on Nasreen's slides was this idea of the Welsh language. Tregroes Waffles, all their packaging bilingual. If ever you have any of their products, you'll see they really sell the Welshness, which is great. So all of these companies are in Wales. Cwmni Da. Now, I spoke about Aardman Animations just now. I will say Cwmni Da were the first film company to become employee owned, and that was before Aardman Animations. I'm not biased, it's all coming from Wales, but it did start in Wales, to be fair. But we also have a lot of knowledge-based and professional services as well. So the research company you see there, Wayville, they are actually doing research for us in Wales at the moment. So there's a wider one going on through the Ownership at Work, but there's a more local one going on at Wales. And we're hoping to launch that, fingers crossed, on Employee Ownership Day, which is the 23rd of June. And so far, you know, the research is looking really good on the socio-economic impact of employee ownership in Wales. Big Innovation, that's another professional services, you know, consultancy. They've quadrupled their workforce since becoming employee owned. So, you know, you can see that there's lots of job creation with this as well. But we've also got dentists, we've got vets, construction, architecture, and things like Tregroes Waffle, which comes under manufacturing. So we've got an array of sectors, and that does kind of mirror the wider UK, only on a smaller level, you know, so the sectors seem to be similar to the rest of the UK. So next slide, please, Dan. I'm going to try and bring employee ownership a bit more to life now then. Does anybody recognise this woolen mill in, actually the name is on there, so that's giving you a big clue, to be fair, based in Pembrokeshire? Well, it's Melyn Tregwynt, okay, so very famous company, you know, and you will see in John Lewis, you'll see Melyn Tregwynt's blankets, etc. You know, so, but they're based in Pembrokeshire. Family business since 1912, about 40 employees. So this business has been handed down through the generations. And on their 101st anniversary, they became employee owned. So we're not selling this business outside of Wales, not a private sale, and doesn't, you know, matter what happens to the workers. This is about a business that remains rooted in Wales, keeping those jobs in Wales, sharing the wealth amongst the workforce, fair work, you know, which we've already heard Nasreen speak about, well-paid jobs. So I'd even say they're decent jobs as well. So decent work and fair work. These are not failing companies. These are very well-established companies who have decided to hand or to sell, the word should be, I think, rather than hand over, it's not a gift, to the employees. And what we've seen with these companies, which once again fits with this whole idea of social partnerships, decent work, fair work, less absenteeism, and that's starting to come out with the research again that is ongoing at the moment. Lower sickness levels. For the exiting owner, So the ones who had passed it from the family over to the employees, they're leaving a legacy in that community, and that's what they wanted. And they also wanted to leave that business in the hands of those employees who had brought it to its current success. And it is a very successful company. And we've got better jobs and we're closer to home, which is another aspect of employee ownership, keeping these jobs in Wales. So I feel, you know, just by illustrating Melyn Tregwynt there, that this does fit with social partnership. I think it's the next slide now. Thank you. Thanks, Dan. So, you know, this fits with so many, or employee ownership fits with so many drivers with Welsh Government. They've seen it as the missing middle of the foundation economy. Okay, so firms rooted in Wales but have the ability to sell outside of Wales. A part of the economic action, on there we go and see prosperity for all, you know, sharing the wealth amongst the workforce, to me, is fair work, prosperity for all, and decent wages as well. It's not just, you know, with the economic action plan, the Welsh Government economic action plan, it's not just about growth, but a fairer way to do business. And once again, sharing this wealth amongst the workforce is a fairer way to do business. Also, you know, we can see there the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Resilient Wales, what we found is that during times of economic uncertainty, employee-owned businesses have really rode the storm and done really well, you know, and that could be the nature of, you know, this employee ownership. Maybe at a time where, you know, economic circumstances aren't favourable, you know, they might get together and say, well, look, we'll all go down to a 4-day a week. You know, we don't make any job losses. Things like that allows them to ride this wave when there's economic downturn. And hopefully the research will bring this out as well. Prosperous Wales, you know, I think the word decent wages fits with prosperous Wales as well. And obviously, we think it fits with the Fair Work agenda. Next one, Dan, please. So, where are we at then in Wales, in the numbers? We see an exponential growth. It's going from strength to strength. When people learn about this model, when we send the right messages out about this model, you know, on all of the examples like Melyn Tregwynt, what we're starting to see is, you know, people just buying into this model and thinking it's a no-brainer, you know. And thanks to Dan as well, Dan Roberts, because when I first took over this in 2017, I needed somebody to help me to get it onto a policy level, and it was Dan Roberts that did that, and I'm very, very grateful for him, and the team are as well, very much so. And we all lobbied Derek as well to get it into the, you know, the programme for government, which it is in now. So, you know, but if we look at the history, you know, employee ownership, the first one for Compass was 1995, and that was like British Coal. You know, they had decided that Tower Colliery was not worth existing anymore, and they were going to make all the employees redundant in that particular area, and the devastation that would have had on that particular workforce. And as we know, 239 workers pulled their redundancy, bought out the mine, and they went on to have, you know, decent, well-paid, fair jobs for another 13 years. So we can see there where the Welsh Government have put a target in their programme for government to double the number of employee-owned businesses during the Senedd term. At the point they came in was roughly the same time, just before or just after I started it. Sorry, there's somebody who wants to come into the meeting, so I'm going to let them in. Yeah. So, so they've promised to double the number of employee-owned businesses in Wales, and basically by the end of the Senedd terms we should be up to about 60, and we're on 56 already. So you can see that we're more than going to double the number of employee-owned businesses during the Senedd term, so it will be done. Is there another slide, Dan? I'm not sure what I put at the end. Or maybe just a summary slide then. So next slide, please, Dan.
There we go.
Okay. So there's some key takeaways then from me. As I said, Welsh Government have committed to double the number of employee-owned businesses in Wales, and as I said, we're way ahead. This is not just about succession, you know, somebody, you know, leaving the business and moving on, you know, it's not about that. It's also about employee engagement, enhancing culture, well-being of the workforce, and building a committed workforce. And I think if you have a say in how that business is run, it's more likely that this will happen, okay? And also using employee ownership to support businesses in Wales, to root them in Wales and in their communities, and to grow and to secure their futures and those of the employees. And to me, this is a great fit with the social partnership agenda. So when Dan asked me to give this presentation, I thought, yeah, it's a lovely fit. So that's me. Thanks, Dan, for your help. And I don't know if there's going to be questions at the end, Vicky, but over to you now.
Thanks very much, Nicola. Yes, I should have said that at the beginning, so we'll go through all three speakers and then questions at the end. But thanks so much, Nicola. I really enjoyed that presentation, obviously with the reference to Tower Colliery as well, which, you know, that buyout really inspired me, and that's what got me interested in politics and got me to join my party. So I always get excited when the story of Tower Colliery gets retold, and it's wonderful to think that we've gone from that one employee-owned business to 56 now in Wales, and lots more coming. And I'm sure, you know, we should all acknowledge that the work of Compass has been absolutely central to that growth. So thank you for all that you have done and are doing on that. Okay, so our third speaker today then is Harry Thompson, who is the Senior Programme and Policy Lead for Fair Work and Economy at Canal Cymru. So welcome, Harry. I know that you're going to be speaking to us this afternoon about the Living Wage Accreditation Scheme. So I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry, I'm just messing with this laptop now. Yeah, thanks for having me. My name's Harry. I work for Canal Cymru with a Real Living Wage Accreditation partner in Wales. That means we're responsible for helping businesses and other organisations to accredit as a real living wage employer. You can see the current, skip slides, you can see the current real living wage rates here, including the Welsh rate of £10.90, that's the rate outside of London. So we receive funding from the Welsh Government to spread the real living wage across Wales as well. So as well as being the partner foundation, we're supported by Welsh Government. And we do this as part of the wider Welsh Government Fair Work agenda. So to explain briefly, Nazreen mentioned Fair Work, and I think the other speaker did too. The definition was provided by the Fair Work Wales Commission a couple of years ago, and that commission was established by the Welsh Government. It has 6 pillars, which you can see here, and one of these you can see is paying your employees a fair wage, a fair reward, and using the real living wage as a pay floor rather than the government's what they call the national living wage. You can see the other 5 pillars here as well. I won't read them all out, but you can see them and the practical examples that sit below them in the Guide to Fair Work that the Welsh Government has put together for businesses. I can put a link to that into the chat when I finish speaking. So there are a range of things that you can do to implement fair work in your organisations as social enterprises or cooperatives. Depending on the circumstances of your business, some of them can be fairly simple to do, such as accrediting as a real living wage employer, which I'll talk a bit more about, or recognised as a trade union. And providing fair work isn't just the right thing to do as well. There's also material benefits to it. So it's part of the Welsh Government's economic contract that it asks businesses it supports to take part in. Just to talk a bit more about the real living wage, what is it? The real living wage is calculated independently based on the costs of goods and services and what people actually need to get by. As we said, it's currently set at £10.90 outside of London, so for the whole of Wales, the rate is £10.90. The Living Wage Foundation announces the new rates every autumn. This year, the announcement's likely to be in October, and then employers have until the following May to implement new rates. The real living wage is calculated by the Resolution Foundation, which is a think tank based in London. its remit is pretty simple. It's to determine the wage rate necessary to ensure that households earn enough to reach a minimum acceptable living standard as defined by the public. Translating that value into a specific wage is quite a complex task. So it takes in a basket of goods, which you can see a picture of here, and services, housing costs, government support schemes, such as the recent financial support to deal with rising energy costs and more factors as well. That the process of calculating these rates is not beholden to any interests other than working out how much people need to reach the basic acceptable minimum living standard in modern UK in any given year. I think something that we really like to point out as well is that we see it as a minimum and a wage floor, and it shouldn't be seen as more than that. It's not the be all and end all. There's far more for employers to do, and we would also encourage employers to pay more than this pay floor if they can. But ethical employers should certainly be looking to pay the real living wage if they can. There's lots of talk at the moment about the cost of living crisis, with employers often having internal discussions about how they can respond. And if your organisation is having those conversations as well, there aren't really many better ways to tackle the cost of living than to giving a pay rise to your lowest paid staff that is based on the cost of living, and also to have a public accreditation as a living wage employer. It's particularly in keeping with the cooperative values of viewing the workforce as an organisation's greatest assets to ensure that you are a living wage employer. And as you'll already know, being paid less than a real living wage and the resultant poverty restricts people's options, leaving them in impossible situations like choosing whether to heat their home or to pay their rent. We've seen with rising living costs and unstable work, in-work poverty is holding lots of people down and stopping many people from choosing their own path in life. Low-paid, unstable jobs mean that more and more families can't put food on the table. One thing we do as the Living Wage Foundation, as the partner in Wales, is bring together case studies. And across the UK, we've got thousands of case studies and stories of why being a real living wage employer matters, and how accreditation and uplift to that rate can change people's lives. There are people across the country on the government minimum wages who have to work multiple jobs to make ends meet. Just as an example, one story that's particularly common is of workers leaving their house as their young kids wake up for school and getting home only as they go into bed. And accreditation and paying a real living wage has meant that people working jobs such as cleaning can work fewer hours to make ends meet, and that actually allows them to actually see their young children in the evening. So it makes a huge difference. It can also mean taking away stressful decisions from people, such as choosing someone feeding their children before themselves, or choosing between putting the heating on or putting food on the table. So becoming an accredited real living wage employer is joining a movement that helps to take these stresses away from people's lives. Employers are not solely responsible for causing in-work poverty or for putting an end to it, but the biggest difference an employer can make, and one way to help loosen poverty's grip on people, is to pay them a fair and livable wage that allows them to live a dignified life and, as a minimum, meets the cost of living. We'll always say it's not the end of the journey. We would always encourage organisations to pay more than the real living wage if they can. And there are other things we can do, such as in that fair work slide, such as trade union access or skills development that employers can also give to their employees. But paying the real living wage is a really good first step, and a key public sign that an employer is looking after its staff during the cost of living crisis. So here's some further information about how the voluntary real living wage that we're talking about here is different to the mandatory minimum set by the government. The real living wage is the only one that's tied to the cost of living in any way. It's different to this government set national minimum wage here, or what they call the national living wage, quite unhelpfully. That government set living wage, as they call it, has no connection to the actual cost of living. It's actually a target which aims to get the level to 66% of median earnings by 2024. So it's ordinarily quite a bit lower than the real living wage calculated based on the real cost of living. The rates are slightly closer at this point than they usually are, because the annual increase in the government set rate here, that £10.42, happens in April, and it was a bigger rise than it normally is. And the real living wage is, the new real living wage rate here is set to be announced later this year, probably in October. Last year it went up by £1, and inflation is still at a pretty similar rate, so we might maybe looking at a similar rise of about £1, although we don't know yet the detail until it's worked out by the Resolution Foundation. The real living wage isn't just targeted at private businesses. We work closely with lots of public bodies too, and we're trying to get as many accredited as real living wage employers as we can. In November 2021, the First Minister actually wrote to all public bodies in Wales to set out the expectation that they should lead by example and become living wage employers, and quite a few of them have. We've got over 30 accredited public bodies in Wales. A range of local authorities, universities, and other public bodies in Wales have accredited, and we've got quite a few more in the pipeline at the moment too. And it does make a huge difference. Here's the difference it's made. We now have over 500 employers across Wales signed up to be real living wage employers. This covers over 128,000 employees with the real living wage. We've given an uplift to over 18,000 workers onto the real living wage. So that's the number of workers that have gone from that government minimum to the real living wage. It's now 18,000 across Wales. And for that 128,000 figure, that's the total that are covered, no matter if they're already on it. But it does mean that they have a pay floor of a wage based on the cost of living. And that's recalculated each year. So it's being uplifted every May at the latest, and that's 128,000 across Wales. So this agenda, this real living wage agenda, can do a huge amount to tackle in-work poverty and the cost of living crisis. And as you can see, it's already doing a huge amount in Wales. So we believe that work can and should be a reliable route out of poverty, and that work should protect employees from poverty. But this can only happen if workers are paid that living wage as a minimum. In a recent Joseph Rowntree Foundation briefing, it was actually found that 4 in 10 households in poverty in Wales contain a full-time worker, and over half in poverty have someone in work, showing that while work reduces the risk of poverty, it often isn't enough to allow someone to escape from poverty. And we don't think it's unreasonable to believe that an individual working a job that pays the government's national living wage on the number of hours expected under the benefit system should not be in poverty. But however, according to research by the Centre for Research and Social Policy at Loughborough University, a full-time job on the national living wage in 2021, that government minimum did not guarantee you the minimum acceptable standard of living that we as a society consider everyone in the UK should be able to have, and that was done before the current high levels of inflation. So that's where the real living wage comes in. Not only does it cover directly employed staff, it also covers third-party contractors. The Living Wage campaign in the UK started with service providers, so it's really important to us that those third-party contractors continue to be included in our work. In order to become accredited, we agree a plan with organisations for them to speak to their third-party contractors to ensure that staff receive the real living wage, at the very least when working for their company. And that's one way that businesses can go beyond their own employees and hopefully ease the pressures of in-work poverty for a wider audience. And you're probably thinking about your own organisations now if you're not accredited. And as you can see, the process is really simple too. Once you're paying all of your own staff a minimum of that real living wage rate, and you have put a plan in place to ensure that third-party contractors you're working with doing the same, you can become a accredited real living wage employer. At Cynnal Cymru, we provide dedicated support, and you'd have a point person who can answer any questions you may have and help you to get over the line to accreditation. So please do get in touch. There'll be contact details on the last slide. But some more evidence, paying the living wage has always been about doing the right thing. With prices rising higher than ever, it's never been more important that employers commit to a real living wage and free workers from that trap of in-work poverty. A living wage is good for people, businesses, and our economy. But we know that sometimes it takes more than doing the right thing, or it being the right thing, to get businesses, even social enterprises, to act. And we know that while this is a really difficult time for workers, the cost of living crisis is also affecting businesses in their ability to do nice things. But we know that accreditation benefits workers and the economy, as well as bringing benefits for businesses. So there's some research here from the Living Wage Foundation and Cardiff University, and they actually surveyed 800 accredited organisations across the UK, and found that 93% of them responded saying that their businesses have benefited since becoming an accredited living wage employer, with some further figures on the screen. I won't read them out, but as you can see, about 81% of employers said they benefited from enhanced corporate reputation too. And in this survey, 64% of accredited employers reported seeing improved relations between staff and employees. And this is a huge benefit when we consider that Fair Work means that workers are involved in how their work is carried out. Their views on matters that concern them are heard and concerns are addressed, and that underrepresented groups, such as those with protected characteristics, are heard. That's all helped dramatically when there's a better relationship between staff and employees, and the Real Living Wage can help to do that. There are a few other schemes we work on too that are a bit less known. As well as the Living Wage Accreditation Scheme, we've got Living Wage Places, and they recognise and celebrate the geographical areas that are doing more to encourage and expand living wage accreditation. They're clusters of employers who pay the living wage and want to spread it further. The most advanced one we have in Wales is Cardiff as a living wage city. That's resulted in nearly £50 million in the pockets of workers. We've also established one in Mid and West Wales, which we're hoping to have recognised as an official living wage place this year, because we've got Carmarthenshire Council and Powys Council on the road to accreditation. A living wage place just requires a strong cross-sector partnership and an inspiring and ambitious vision, backed up by a clear strategy and action plan. And these are places where communities and businesses are working together to tackle low pay within their localities. I'm actually speaking from Spark in Cardiff today, which is the first living wage building in Wales. And we've also got living hours, and I really think that this is becoming increasingly important. So research by the Living Wage Foundation in 2021 found that 21% of workers in the UK experience work insecurity. So that's 6.6 million workers across the country. And unfortunately, Wales has comparatively high levels of insecure workers, and that figure is actually 26% in Wales. So 1 in 4 employees in Wales experience insecure hours. The Living Wage campaign is fundamentally based on the belief that nobody should be working full time and still earning less than they need to live. But we need to recognise that levels of in-work poverty are also affected by the number and the security of hours that people work. So while many people might choose to work part-time and flexibly to balance work with caring responsibilities and other out-of-work commitments, these jobs we know are more likely to be low paid and involve casualised working arrangements with one-sided flexibility in favour of the employer. In-work poverty remains an ongoing problem in the UK, and many workers are grappling with insecure contracts and unreliable hours in addition to that low pay. So we know that a decent hourly rate isn't always going to be able to be enough to protect people from poverty if they can't work enough hours, which is something we see quite commonly. So in 2019, the Living Wage Foundation launched this Living Hours scheme. It's an additional accreditation scheme to get accredited as a living hours employer too now. And it's designed to provide workers with secure hours, predictable shifts, and working contracts which reflect actual hours worked, alongside the real living wage. So you have to be a real living wage employer to then become a living hours employer as well. An accredited living hours employer is required to provide at least 4 weeks notice for shifts with guaranteed payment if shifts are cancelled within that notice period. The right to a contract that reflects accurate hours worked, a guaranteed minimum of 16 hours a week unless the worker themselves requests fewer. And living hours can help to offer a practical solution that employers can adopt to help provide the security and stability that low paid workers need to make ends meet, so they've got that predictable pay coming in every month. So thank you very much for listening to me today. It would be great to get everyone on this call working in their own organisations to accredit as a real living wage employer. What we see is lots of you might already be at that level already, so it makes good business sense to accredit and let the people you work with know. But even if you're already paying the rate, it also makes good moral sense to accredit, because it helps to ensure that your organisation is paying the living wage in future years too, because you'll always uplift to that new rate. If you do accredit, you'll be able to use the living wage branding, and we'll send you a plaque to put up in your office too. And if your organisation isn't paying the rate at the moment, we can have a chat with you to give you advice about making the case internally to uplift employees onto the real living wage rates. Like I said, we provide free bespoke support. You'll have your own point person to talk with who will help you to get accredited. So whatever your situation, your organisation is, please do get in touch. My email, sorry, is on this slide. So please do feel free to drop me a message, no matter your position in your organisation or how speculative the email is, and we can see what can be done. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much indeed, Harry. That was really interesting, especially looking at the aspect of living hours as well. Adds a whole new dimension into what we know people need in order to have that basic standard of living that everyone should be entitled to. Okay, so we are going to move now to a Q&A, so people can ask questions to all of our speakers if they want to, or direct questions to just one. It's entirely up to you. But if I could ask people to raise their virtual hand if they'd like to ask a question, that would be really helpful for me then in the chair. Joel, hi.
All right, thanks, Nikki, and thanks ever so much for today's cross-party group. It's absolutely fascinating. I just wanted to have a quick question, if I could, to Nazreen. During your presentation, you mentioned about with the like the social partnership element and how sort of like housing associations and then other bodies that unfortunately aren't covered with it. And I just wanted to get sort of your idea as to why that was the case then, because you mentioned at the start that sort of the trade unions work quite closely with the Welsh Government to try and get the legislation through. And I just wanted to know what your sort of feedback from them was as to why that wasn't, why they weren't included within the legislation. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Joel. So my understanding is that the list of public bodies covered by the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is fairly restricted because it would be overly burdensome for it to apply to something like a school, for instance. And I think that's partly the reason why it doesn't apply to, you know, some of what would come to mind as a public body. I think when it comes to housing associations in universities, though, it does have to do with their status. And I know the acronym is NPIT, and I can't remember for the life of me what it stands for, and it's got something to do with public accounts, but I think it's to do with their sort of semi, like almost quasi-public status, public sector status. So they're not quite falling into that category. But when it comes to the socially responsible public procurement duties, housing associations were included in the draft of the bill, and then they were dropped from the final version of the bill, and that is something we were a bit disappointed about because as I mentioned in the presentation, the amount that they spend, you know, it's a significant part of public spending in Wales, and it's you know, it's a lever at the public sector's disposal really to try to influence change. Thank you.
Thanks, Nazreen. Thanks, Joel, for that question. I can see Joel was busy taking notes then, so I think he's probably going to challenge the Deputy Minister on that, but I might give him a cheer if he did that also. Okay, fantastic. Let's see if there's anyone else with any questions then. I'll ask a question, see if this warms people up. Harry, I'm just wondering, with social enterprises in particular, what do you think might be the barriers there to delivering the living wage?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question. I actually think it's probably easier for social enterprises because I think that sense of morality is already built into organisations that are social enterprises and cooperatives. I think there's already in a lot of them a real mission real mission, sense of mission to making society a better place and delivering for employees. I think so. I think it can be a massive benefit. I can't actually see that there'll be more barriers for cooperatives. There'll be a different process because often it is driven by sort of CEOs and people at the top when they decide they want the accreditation and the badge, all those shiny things, and then they work, and it comes from a top-down approach. So it's a different process for social enterprises because they're more democratic internally. But I think real living wage accreditation does fit really well with those types of employers, and I think that's probably why we see quite higher levels of accreditation amongst them.
Thanks, that's a really interesting answer. And I know Nicola said she's received a question, so Nicola, please share with us the question and your response.
Yeah, somebody's emailed me and asked me about this doubling of the number of employee-owned businesses in Wales throughout the Senedd term. What was the starting number and what's the end number? So it was 30, and we need to get it up to 60, and we're on 56. So that should be achieved, I'd say.
Oh, thanks for clarifying that, Nicola. It's useful to have that statistic to hand, and I'll ask you a follow-up question if I may. So I'm always interested in how the Welsh Government can use education to ensure that young people are aware of all sorts of different employment opportunities. To your mind, is there enough in the curriculum, and the new curriculum, I should say, that would educate young people about what employee ownership is and the benefits of it? Or is that an area perhaps that needs a little bit of a push?
Well, that's really good timing, that question, Vicky, because Jeremy Miles announced last week that he's going to establish the Robert Owen Fund, I think he's calling it, but it'll be to embed different business models, in particular cooperatives, employee ownership, into the curriculum, and that's what that fund will be used for. So Robert Owen being the founder of the cooperative movement. So I do think it is something that we need to do more of. And hopefully this resource will allow us to do that, but also continuity of existing materials that have been developed. So, in the past, for example, I wrote a Welsh Baccalaureate challenge, on cooperatives, and also lesson plans for teachers and things like that. And I think we need more of that. So we need to do it in a cost-effective way as well. Because if we think about the number of schools, colleges and universities that are in Wales, we've got to get the message out there. So I think we've got to use this fund to ensure that it's accessible to all. But certainly, yeah, there's going to be more work in that area.
Thanks very much, Nicola. I'm just checking down the list of participants. I can't see anyone else with a hand raised, but if I have missed someone, then please feel free to unmute yourselves and give us a shout.
I was just going to jump in and say on the point around the living wage and social enterprise. So I think we've just had the mapping done, and that's research we do every 2 years that maps the social enterprise sector in Wales, and that found that 66% of social enterprises in Wales pay the living wage, which is considerably higher than the wider private sector. And I think that's right based on what Harry was saying, is that social enterprises have this triple bottom line of focusing on being economically sustainable and being thriving businesses, but also considering just to the same level of importance the impact they're having socially on their communities, on their workers, and then also environmentally. So I think one important thing that we need to do as people who want to develop this fairer economy is think about how can we communicate with the businesses in Wales, with the social enterprises, and make sure they're aware of the options that are available to them. And hopefully we've seen today the social partnership legislation can be a big step towards that. But we need to make sure that the businesses, social enterprises, wider private sector are all aware of it, and how their actions can fit into it, and how this can be an opportunity for them. So, any ideas about, how we can communicate with the sector, with the private sector, about these opportunities, I think would be really, really important to consider as well.
Thanks, Dan. That's definitely something important for us to take away and cogitate over. So it looks like we're drawing to a natural close for today's meeting then. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers, Nisreen, Nicola and Harry, for some really interesting and diverse contributions. And we'll be in touch with everyone soon with details of our next meeting and the topics that we'll be looking at then. So I hope that you've all enjoyed today's meeting. I hope that you found it useful and it's given you food for thought and things that you can take away. Certainly given me lots of ideas of things that I can be working on and raising in the chamber. So thank you all very much indeed. Thank you for all our attendees. And I'll say now, meeting closed.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, diolch yn fawr pawb.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Diolch, bye.